I died on a Tuesday. I remember because it was trash day, and I could hear the garbage truck rumbling past the hospital window when my heart finally gave out. 28 years old, and I died alone in a county hospital with exactly $47 in my bank account and a body that had been failing since I was 16. The nurses didn't cry, my parents didn't come. The only person who noticed I was gone was the orderly who had to clear out my room for the next patient. But here's the thing about dying alone and unloved: you have a lot of time to think on the way out. And what I thought about as my vision tunneled and my chest refused to rise again was how perfectly, meticulously, completely I had been erased. Then I woke up. I was 14 again, sitting in Dr. Morrison's office with my mother's hand on my shoulder, a gesture that looked loving to anyone watching but was really just her fingernails digging into my collarbone hard enough to bruise. Across from us, Dr. Morrison was reviewing test results, and I knew exactly what he was about to say because I'd lived this moment before. "The fatigue and joint pain Sarah's experiencing are likely juvenile arthritis," he said, exactly as he had 14 years ago. "We'll need to start treatment immediately and monitor closely. There's also some concerning irregularities in her blood work that we should investigate further." "Is it genetic?" my mother interrupted. Her nails dug deeper. I didn't flinch this time. Dr. Morrison looked surprised by the question. "Well, there can be hereditary factors, but because we're in the process of adopting another child," my mother continued smoothly. "A girl about Sarah's age. I need to know if this is something that could be problematic for the adoption." I watched Dr. Morrison's face carefully. I'd forgotten this part, how transparent his disapproval had been, how quickly my mother had made us switch doctors after this appointment. In my first life, I'd been too sick and too young to understand what was happening. I'd thought my mother was worried about me. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Morrison said carefully, "Sarah's health issues shouldn't have any bearing on another child's adoption. They're not contagious, if that's your concern." "Of course not." My mother's laugh was crystalline, perfect. "I just want to be prepared. This adoption is very important to us. The girl, Lily, has had such a difficult life. She deserves stability, and I need to know what we might be dealing with medically. Family history is so important for these agencies." That's when I understood. In my first life, I hadn't put it together until much later. Years later, actually, when I was dying in that county hospital and finally requested my medical records. That's when I'd seen the inconsistencies, the altered dates, the way my childhood medical history had been edited. Certain diagnoses moved around, symptoms attributed to me that had never been mine, a medical narrative that didn't quite match my memories. They'd used my medical history for Lily's adoption. Lily, who appeared in our home 3 months after this appointment, was supposedly an orphan from a failed adoption. That's what my parents told everyone. Poor thing, such a tragic background, they'd opened their hearts to give her a better life. She was sweet and grateful and everything I wasn't. She was healthy where I was sick. She was vibrant where I was tired. She was their real daughter in every way that mattered. Except she wasn't healthy. Lily had severe bipolar disorder that went undiagnosed for years. She had early onset arthritis. She had the same autoimmune issues that plagued me. She had everything I had, actually, because her medical records said she had my clean bill of health from before I got sick, and my medical records had been altered to include her pre-existing conditions. The adoption agency had required medical histories. My parents had wanted Lily, and I, the inconvenient biological daughter who'd started developing expensive chronic health problems, had been the perfect solution. They'd given Lily my past, they'd given me her future, and they'd made sure everyone believed I was the sick one, the broken one, the one who would never be quite right. It made it so much easier to explain why they preferred her, why they paid for her college but not mine, why she got the master bedroom and I got the converted storage room, why she was their daughter and I was just Sarah. In my first life, I'd figured it out too late. I'd died too young, too poor, too sick to do anything about it. But I'd had just enough time in those final moments to understand exactly how I'd been erased. Now I was 14 again. And I had a choice. I could stop it. I could refuse to go along with the medical appointments, could raise hell, could tell someone what they were planning. But who would believe me? I was a child. They were respected members of the community. My father owned 3 car dealerships. My mother was on the hospital board. I had no proof of something that hadn't happened yet. Or I could let it happen. I could let them use my medical history for Lily's adoption, exactly as they planned. But this time, I wouldn't be a passive victim. This time, I would be an active participant. This time, I would make sure the inconsistencies were impossible to miss. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Morrison was saying, I really think we should focus on Sarah's treatment plan rather than the. Of course, my mother said. Sarah's health is our top priority. Isn't it, sweetheart? Her nails dug in again. I looked up at her and smiled. Yes, Mom. The smile seemed to unsettle her. Good. Over the next 3 months, I became a very cooperative patient. I went to every appointment. I took every test. I answered every question. And I remembered everything, every symptom, every date, every diagnosis. I memorized my medical records with the precision of someone who knew they'd need to testify about them someday. But I also started adding things, little things, inconsistencies that wouldn't be obvious now but would be glaring later. I told Dr. Chen, we'd switched doctors as predicted, that my joint pain was worse in my left knee. 2 weeks later, I said it was definitely the right knee. I described my fatigue as morning exhaustion in one appointment and evening crashes in another. I mentioned a rash that came and went. I described headaches with symptoms that didn't quite match any known pattern. I was the perfect difficult patient, sick enough to be concerning, inconsistent enough to be frustrating. And I watched my parents carefully at each appointment, saw how they took notes, saw how my mother always asked for copies of everything for our records, saw how she met with the adoption agency caseworker every Friday afternoon at the coffee shop downtown. I followed her once, skipping school to watch through the window as my mother slid a manila folder across the table. My medical file. The one she was giving them. The one that was supposedly Lily's. Is this everything? The caseworker asked. I couldn't hear her, but I could read lips, a skill I'd learned in my first life when my hearing started failing. That had been in Lily's original medical history, too, I'd eventually realized. The genetic hearing loss that I'd been diagnosed with at 23 had actually been hers all along. Complete medical history, my mother confirmed. Clean bill of health, no hereditary issues, no chronic conditions, just a normal, healthy girl. The caseworker flipped through the file. And you're sure about this? The background check flagged some concerns. Nothing that matters, my mother said firmly. Trust me. This girl deserves a good home, and we're prepared to provide it. My husband and I have been trying for another child for years. This is meant to be. Watching my mother lie so smoothly, so completely, I felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't anger. I'd had 14 years of death to work through my anger. It was clarity. Pure crystalline clarity about who my parents really were and what they were really doing. They weren't saving Lily. They were replacing me. I'd become medically inconvenient, expensive, a liability. Lily was healthy, supposedly, cheaper, and came with a tragic backstory that made them look magnanimous. It was a trade, a calculated exchange, and they'd falsified medical records to make it happen. I started keeping my own records, every appointment, every symptom I reported, every date and time. I wrote it all down in a journal I hid in the air vent in my room, the same vent where, in my first life, I'd hidden my college fund money, the money my parents had borrowed and never returned. Then I started making the inconsistencies more obvious. I told Dr. Chen I'd never broken a bone. The next visit, I mentioned breaking my arm at age 7, said I had no allergies, then casually mentioned my penicillin allergy. I described my menstrual cycle as regular, then irregular, then said I hadn't started menstruating yet. I had, but who was checking? I was building a medical history that contradicted itself so fundamentally that anyone who looked closely would see the holes. But no one was looking closely, not at me. They were looking at Lily, the girl who would arrive in 3 months and take my place in every way that mattered. In my first life, Lily had been confused when she arrived. She'd expected to be adopted by a different family, she'd told me once, late at night when we were supposed to be sleeping. She'd been in the system since she was 8 after her mother's overdose. She'd had a rough life, foster homes, group homes, instability. She'd been so grateful to my parents, so desperate to please them that she'd ignored every red flag. She'd also been sick, really sick. But the adoption agency had cleared her as healthy, so when she started showing symptoms, the fatigue, the joint pain, the brain fog, my parents had dismissed it as adjustment issues. By the time anyone realized how serious it was, her medical history said she'd always been healthy. Her medical history said I was the sick one. The record said she was fine and I was falling apart. She'd believed it too. That's what had hurt most in my first life. Lily had believed she was fine and I was the problem. She'd believed my parents when they said I was exaggerating, attention-seeking, making excuses. She'd been their real daughter, and I'd been the biological mistake they were stuck with. We hadn't been friends, we hadn't been sisters, we'd been strangers living in the same house, competing for resources only one of us was allowed to win. But that was the old timeline. This time would be different. The day Lily arrived, I was ready. I stood in the foyer in the dress my mother had picked out, blue, demure, the perfect older sister outfit, and watched my parents bring her through the door. She looked exactly as I remembered. 15 years old, dark hair, uncertain smile, eyes that had seen too much. She was thin, almost fragile, and she moved carefully, like someone who'd learned not to take up too much space. "Sarah," my mother said warmly, "this is Lily, your new sister." Lily looked at me with hope and fear warring in her expression. "Hi," she said softly. In my first life, I'd resented her immediately. I'd been 14, sick, and suddenly invisible in my own home. I'd watched my parents dote on her, and I'd hated her for it. This time, I walked up to her and took her hand. "Welcome home," I said, and I meant it, because Lily wasn't my enemy. She never had been. She was a victim too, a girl who'd been used by my parents just like I had been. They'd falsified her medical records, set her up for years of undiagnosed illness, and made her complicit in their insurance fraud without her knowledge or consent. The real enemies were downstairs, putting on a show for the caseworker who'd brought Lily for the final home visit. I squeezed Lily's hand. "I'm glad you're here," I said quietly. "Really?" She looked surprised, then relieved. "Thank you," she whispered. Over the next 6 months, I did two things simultaneously. I made sure Lily felt welcome, and I made sure the medical inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. With Lily, I was kind. I helped her adjust to her new school. I shared my room. My mother had insisted it would look good for the adoption finalization, she said. I listened when Lily talked about her nightmares, her fears, her desperate hope that this family would finally be the one that wanted her. I didn't tell her what my parents had done. Not yet. She needed stability, and she needed time. Besides, I had a plan, and it required Lily to be settled, to be part of the family before everything fell apart. With the medical records, I was meticulous. I kept getting sick, or rather, I kept reporting symptoms that didn't quite match my previous symptoms. I went to new doctors. My mother kept switching me, frustrated by the lack of a clear diagnosis. I made sure each new doctor got a slightly different version of my medical history. I mentioned previous diagnoses that didn't exist in my records. I contradicted myself constantly, and I started asking questions. "Mom," I said one evening, "I need my medical records for the school nurse. She says there's something wrong with my file." My mother didn't even look up from her phone. "I'll handle it." "But she specifically said the dates don't match. Something about my vaccination records?" "Sarah, I said I'll handle it. It's just weird because I remember getting my vaccinations at the clinic downtown, but the records say I got them at Dr. Morrison's office and we stopped seeing him when I was 14. Enough." My mother's voice was sharp. "I'll call the school tomorrow. Drop it." I dropped it, but I'd planted the seed. I did the same thing with the insurance company, casually mentioning inconsistencies when they called about claims. I did it with the pharmacy, questioning prescription dates. I did it with my school counselor, wondering aloud why my medical file seemed to have different information than what I remembered. I scattered breadcrumbs everywhere, building a trail of inconsistencies that would eventually lead back to one conclusion. Someone had been altering medical records. The real trap, though, was Lily herself. 6 months after her arrival, Lily started getting sick. Just like in my first life. She was exhausted all the time. Her joints hurt. She had mysterious rashes and headaches. My parents dismissed it as stress, adjustment issues, growing pains. but I didn't. You should see a doctor, I told her one night when she was crying from the pain in her knees. Your parents said it's normal, she whispered. Just part of adapting to a new home. Lily, I have juvenile arthritis. Those are exactly the symptoms I had when I was diagnosed. This isn't normal. She looked at me with wide eyes. But I can't be sick. My medical records. What about your medical records? They're clean. The caseworker said so. No hereditary issues, no chronic conditions. That's why your parents could adopt me. If I was sick, it would have complicated things. I sat up in bed. Lily, who told you that? Your mom. She said the agency was really thorough. They checked everything. She paused. She said I was lucky to be so healthy, especially compared to you. I'm sorry, that sounds awful, but it's fine, I said quickly. But Lily, if you're in pain, you need to see a doctor, regardless of what your records say. I don't want to cause problems, she said. Your parents have been so good to me. I don't want them to regret adopting me. And there it was, the same fear I'd had, the same desperate need to be wanted. My parents had weaponized our vulnerabilities against both of us. You wouldn't be causing problems, I said firmly. You'd be taking care of yourself, that's different. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. The next morning, I went to my mother's home office. I'd never been allowed in there without permission, but I had a rebirth's worth of knowledge about where my mother kept things. I knew the password to her computer, my father's birthday, pathetically obvious. I knew where she filed important documents. And I knew exactly what I was looking for. It took me 20 minutes to find the adoption file. It was buried in a folder labeled Charitable Donations 2019. My mother's idea of irony, probably. Inside were all the documents from Lily's adoption process, including her medical records, the ones that were supposedly her clean bill of health. I pulled out my phone, another gift of rebirth. I knew exactly how to navigate modern technology this time, and photographed every page. Then I compared them to my own medical records, which I'd been collecting in my secret journal. They were identical, not similar. Identical. Same doctor visits, same dates, same diagnoses, except my name was on my copies and Lily's name was on these. My mother had literally taken my medical history from before I got sick and put Lily's name on it. I photographed the adoption caseworker's notes, too. There were concerns about Lily's background, multiple mentions of behavioral issues at previous placements, suspected mental health concerns, unconfirmed medical needs, red flags everywhere. But then there was a note dated 3 weeks before Lily's placement. Medical concerns addressed. Mrs. Chen provided comprehensive medical history showing no hereditary issues. Proceeding with placement. Mrs. Chen provided. Not Lily's actual medical records, not documentation from her previous foster placements. My mother had provided my medical history and passed it off as Lily's. I took pictures of everything, then carefully put the file back exactly where I'd found it. Then I went back to my room, pulled out my laptop, and started researching adoption fraud, medical identity theft, and insurance fraud. I needed to understand exactly what crimes my parents had committed and how to prove it. The answer was simpler than I expected. I needed someone official to look at the records and see the inconsistencies. Someone with the authority to investigate. Someone who would take it seriously. I needed the adoption agency to audit their own files. The question was how to make that happen without tipping off my parents that I knew anything. The answer came from an unexpected source. Lily's joint pain got worse. 3 months after I'd found the falsified records, Lily could barely walk. She was in constant pain, exhausted to the point of collapsing, and my parents were running out of excuses. They couldn't ignore it anymore, especially when her school called about her excessive absences. Fine, my mother snapped one evening. We'll take her to a doctor, Sarah's doctor. They can see if it's the same arthritis issue. That's when I made my move. Mom, I said carefully, if Lily has the same thing I have, the doctors are going to wonder why it didn't show up in her medical history. The adoption agency required full disclosure of hereditary conditions. My mother went very still. What are you talking about? I mean, juvenile arthritis can be hereditary, right? If Lily has it and it wasn't in her medical records when you adopted her, that could be a problem. The agency might think you weren't given accurate information. I watched her process this, saw the moment she realized the trap she was in. If Lily got diagnosed with the same conditions I had, someone might look too closely at her medical history, might notice that her records didn't match her symptoms, might start asking questions. It's not hereditary in Lily's case, my mother said firmly. She's adopted. There's no genetic connection. Right, but they'll still check her records. They'll want to know her family medical history to rule out hereditary factors. That's standard procedure. My mother's face went white. Sarah, why are you so interested in this? I'm not, I said innocently. I just don't want Lily to go through what I went through. The doctors ran a million tests on me before they figured out what was wrong. If her records can help them diagnose faster, that's good, right? She stared at me for a long moment. I kept my expression neutral, concerned, sisterly. Go to your room, she finally said. I went, and I listened at the top of the stairs as she immediately called my father. We have a problem, she hissed into the phone. Lily's sick. Like, actually sick. The same thing Sarah has. If we take her to a doctor— She paused. I know we can't not take her, but the records— Another pause. Yes, I'm aware what we did was illegal. I'm also aware we don't have a choice now. I smiled in the darkness of the stairwell. They took Lily to Dr. Chen the next day. I insisted on coming along. For moral support, I said sweetly. My mother couldn't refuse without looking suspicious. Dr. Chen ran tests, lots of tests. And with each one, I watched my mother's expression get tighter. I'm going to need Lily's complete medical history, Dr. Chen said finally. Everything from before the adoption. Foster care records, any previous diagnoses, family history if available. We have all that, my mother said quickly. The adoption agency provided comprehensive records. Good, I'll need copies for her file. He turned to Lily. In the meantime, I'm seeing a lot of symptoms that concern me. Joint inflammation, chronic fatigue, some markers in your blood work that suggest autoimmune issues. Have you experienced these symptoms before? Lily looked at my mother nervously. I don't think so. Nothing in your previous placements? No medical issues that required ongoing treatment? The agency said she was healthy, my mother interrupted. Clean bill of health. Dr. Chen frowned. That's odd. These conditions don't usually appear overnight. There should have been warning signs. He looked at Lily again. Are you sure you haven't had these symptoms before? Maybe they were dismissed or misdiagnosed? Lily started, then stopped. I mean, I was tired a lot in my last foster home, and my knees hurt sometimes, but they said I was just growing. How long ago was this? A year, maybe longer? Dr. Chen made a note. So before the adoption, which means it should be in your medical records. He looked at my mother. I'll need those records as soon as possible. If she had previous symptoms that were missed, it's crucial we have that information. Of course, my mother said tightly. I'll have them sent over. She didn't, obviously, because those records would show that Lily hadn't been healthy at all. They'd show behavioral issues, suspected mental health problems, and multiple mentions of unexplained physical symptoms that had been dismissed by overwhelmed foster care systems. They'd show a girl who needed medical attention and wasn't getting it. They'd show exactly what my parents had hidden to secure the adoption. I waited 2 weeks, long enough for Dr. Chen to follow up requesting the records, long enough for my mother to make excuses. Then I made an appointment with my school counselor. I'm worried about my sister, I said, playing the concerned sibling perfectly. She's really sick, and I don't think my parents are taking it seriously enough. Mrs. Patterson, the counselor, nodded sympathetically. I understand you've had health issues yourself. That must make it harder to watch Lily go through something similar. It's just, I don't think her medical records are right. Mrs. Patterson looked up sharply. What do you mean? Her adoption records say she's healthy, but she has all the same symptoms I have, and I was diagnosed years ago. So Either she suddenly developed a bunch of rare conditions overnight, or I trailed off, letting her fill in the blanks. Or her medical records were inaccurate, Ms. Patterson said slowly. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything, I said quickly. I just think maybe the agency made a mistake. Or her foster parents didn't report things properly. But someone should check, right? Before her health gets worse? Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. Sarah, what you're suggesting is serious. Adoption agencies are required to provide accurate medical information. If there was a discrepancy, it would be a significant issue. I know, that's why I'm scared to say anything to my parents. They're already stressed about Lily being sick. But I keep thinking, what if she needs treatment she's not getting because her records are wrong? It was a perfect dilemma. Either the adoption agency had messed up, or my parents had. Either way, someone needed to investigate. Let me make some calls, Mrs. Patterson said. I thank you for coming to me, Sarah. You did the right thing. I left her office and went to my next class, and I waited. The adoption agency called my parents 3 days later. I know because I heard my mother's side of the conversation. She didn't know I was home, didn't know I was listening outside her office door. An audit? Why would you need to audit Lily's file? Her voice was shrill with panic. A school counselor raised concerns? About what? A pause. Medical records? Her medical records are fine. You approved them yourself. Another pause. Longer this time. I understand you need to follow up on any concerns, but this is ridiculous. We've been nothing but transparent throughout this entire process. Her voice took on a pleading tone. Please, this is going to upset Lily. She's already struggling with health issues. The last thing she needs is to feel like her adoption is being questioned. I heard her hang up, heard something crash, probably her coffee mug against the wall, heard her call my father. They're auditing the adoption file, she said, her voice shaking. They're going to compare Lily's medical records with her symptoms. They're going to talk to her previous foster families. They're going to find out. She stopped. What do we do? I didn't hear my father's response. But I didn't need to. I knew exactly what they'd do. They'd panic, scramble, try to cover their tracks. And in doing so, they'd make more mistakes. They'd make the inconsistencies impossible to miss. The audit took 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which my parents became increasingly paranoid, during which Lily got sicker, during which I documented everything in my secret journal and waited for the walls to close in. The adoption agency sent an investigator. Mrs. Rodriguez was in her 50s, professional, thorough. She interviewed Lily privately, something that terrified my parents. She requested medical records from all of Lily's previous placements. She compared those records to what my parents had submitted, and she found exactly what I'd known she'd find. Nothing matched. The medical history my parents had provided for Lily showed a healthy child with no chronic conditions, regular checkups, and normal development. The actual records from her foster placements showed a girl with unexplained fatigue, joint pain, behavioral issues linked to undiagnosed mental health concerns, and multiple notations about needed medical follow-up that never happened. But here's where it got interesting. Mrs. Rodriguez also requested my medical records. Standard procedure, apparently, when checking for hereditary conditions in adopted siblings, and that's when she found the inconsistencies. My medical records showed conditions appearing at age 14, but several of the symptoms and diagnoses had been backdated to earlier ages. The vaccination records didn't match. The growth charts were inconsistent. There were mentions of treatments I'd supposedly received before doctors who didn't start treating me until later. Someone had altered medical records, and there was only one person who had access to both Lily's adoption file and my medical history. Mrs. Rodriguez came to the house on a Tuesday, fitting since I'd died on a Tuesday in my first life. She brought a colleague from the State Fraud Investigation Unit, and she brought copies of all the medical records laid out on our dining room table in careful chronological order. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, she said calmly, we need to discuss some serious irregularities we've found. My parents sat on one side of the table. Lily and I sat on the other. I'd made sure we were both present. Lily deserved to hear this, and I deserved to watch. Mrs. Rodriguez opened the first file. This is the medical history you provided for Lily during the adoption process. It shows a healthy child with no chronic conditions. She opened another file. These are the actual medical records from Lily's foster placements. As you can see, they tell a very different story. My mother's face was pale. The agency provided those records. We didn't. Mrs. Chen, you specifically told the caseworker that you had obtained medical records that showed Lily was healthy. You provided documentation to support this claim. I was told those were accurate. By whom? Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was sharp. The records you provided don't match any official documentation we've been able to locate. In fact, she pulled out another file. They appear to be identical to your biological daughter's medical history from before her diagnosis with juvenile arthritis. The room went very quiet. That's not possible, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's not only possible, it's provable. Mrs. Rodriguez spread out more papers. Same doctor visits, same dates, same vaccination schedule. The only difference is the name. You took Sarah's medical history and gave it to Lily. Lily made a small sound beside me. I reached under the table and squeezed her hand. Why would we do that? My mother asked, but it came out desperate rather than indignant. That's what we'd like to know, but I can speculate. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at Lily gently. Lily came from a difficult background. She'd been in multiple foster placements. She had medical issues that hadn't been properly addressed. Those issues would have made adoption more complicated, more expensive, more time-consuming, potentially disqualifying. We wanted to help her, my mother started. By lying, Mrs. Rodriguez cut her off. By committing fraud, by denying her access to appropriate medical care because her real medical history would have revealed the truth? We didn't deny her medical care, my father said. She's seeing a doctor now. Now, after she became so sick she couldn't hide it anymore. After the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Rodriguez turned to Lily. Honey, how long have you been feeling tired and in pain? Lily's voice was small. Since before I came here. And did anyone in your previous placements take you to a doctor about it? Sometimes, but they said it was growing pains. Or stress. They said I was fine. And your adoptive parents? Did they take you to a doctor when you first mentioned the symptoms? Lily looked at my mother, confused and hurt. They said it was adjustment issues, that it would get better once I settled in. Mrs. Rodriguez made a note. Then she turned to me. Sarah, I understand you've been diagnosed with juvenile arthritis and several related autoimmune conditions. Yes, I said clearly. When were you diagnosed? At 14, about a year before Lily came to live with us. And did your symptoms appear suddenly? No, I'd been having issues for about a year before that. Joint pain, fatigue, other things. My parents took me to several doctors before we got a diagnosis. So you were seeing doctors regularly, having tests done, building a medical history? Yes. And during this time, your parents were in the process of adopting Lily. I paused, as if considering this. I guess so. I didn't really know much about the adoption process. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded. But your medical records show some interesting inconsistencies. Dates that don't match. Diagnoses that seem to be backdated. Symptoms attributed to earlier ages than when you actually experienced them. She looked at my parents. It's as if someone was trying to make Sarah's medical history look worse than it was early on. And Lily's medical history look better than it was. That's absurd, my mother started. It's insurance fraud at minimum, Mrs. Rodriguez interrupted. Medical identity theft, falsification of adoption records, and depending on how deep this goes, potentially child endangerment for denying Lily appropriate medical care. The room exploded then. My mother was shouting about being accused of crimes they didn't commit. My father was demanding lawyers. Mrs. Rodriguez was calmly stating that they could certainly involve attorneys, but The evidence was clear, and they would be conducting a full investigation. And Lily? Lily was crying. "You lied?" she whispered, looking at my parents. "You lied to adopt me?" "Honey, no." My mother reached for her, but Lily pulled away. "You said I was healthy. You said the agency checked everything. You said—" Her voice broke. "I've been sick for so long. I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I was imagining it. But you knew. You knew I needed help, and you didn't—" "We did help you," my mother insisted. "We gave you a home, a family." "You gave her stolen medical records," I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me. "You took my medical history and put her name on it so you could adopt her without dealing with her real health issues. And then when she got sick, you ignored it because treating her would have exposed what you'd done." "Sarah," my father's voice was warning. "No," I stood up. "I'm done being quiet. I'm done pretending I don't see what you did." I looked at Mrs. Rodriguez. "I have evidence. I've been documenting the inconsistencies in my medical records for months. I have notes from appointments, dates of symptoms, everything. I can prove the records were altered." My mother's face went from white to red. You set us up." "No," I said calmly, "Sasan. You set yourselves up. I just made sure someone would notice." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at me with something like approval. "Can you provide these documents?" "They're in my room." "I'll get them." I left the dining room and went upstairs. Behind me, I could hear my mother's raised voice, my father's futile attempts to maintain control, Lily's continued crying. I pulled my journal from its hiding place in the air vent, along with the photographs I'd taken of the adoption file and every inconsistent medical record I'd collected. When I came back downstairs, my mother was standing, pointing at me with shaking hand. "She's lying," my mother said. "She's a sick child who's angry about having to share attention. She's making this up." "I'm not," I said, handing the journal to Mrs. Rodriguez. "It's all in there. Every appointment, every symptom I reported, every inconsistency in the records. Compare it to the official files. You'll see the pattern." Mrs. Rodriguez opened the journal. Her colleague looked over her shoulder. They read in silence for several minutes while my parents watched helplessly. "This is very thorough," Mrs. Rodriguez said finally. "These notes detail not only inconsistencies in your medical records, but also documentation of how those records were accessed and when." She looked at my parents. "There are entries here about Mrs. Chen requesting copies of Sarah's medical files multiple times, always around the same dates as meetings with the adoption caseworker." "I needed those for insurance purposes," my mother tried. "You needed them to create a false medical history for Lily," Ms. Rodriguez said flatly. She turned to her colleague. "We need to take this to the state attorney's office." "No," my father stood up. "You can't do this. We were trying to help a child. We were trying to give her a better life. If there were administrative errors in the process, that doesn't make us criminals." "Administrative errors?" Mrs. Rodriguez repeated. "Mr. Chen, you and your wife deliberately falsified medical records, committed fraud during an adoption process, and denied a child in your care appropriate medical treatment. These aren't errors. These are crimes." "We want a lawyer," my mother said. "That's your right." Mrs. Rodriguez stood, gathering the files. "But I need to inform you that this investigation is ongoing. The adoption is being suspended pending review. Lily will be placed with a temporary foster family." "No!" Lily stood up, panicking. I can't go back." "It's temporary," Ms. Rodriguez said gently. "Just until we sort this out." "She can stay with me," I said suddenly. Everyone looked at me. "I'm 18. I paused. In my first life, I'd been 18 when I'd aged out of my parents' concern entirely, when they'd made it clear I was on my own. I'd been 18 when I'd moved into a shitty apartment and started the long, slow decline that had ended in that county hospital. But here now I was 14. I mean, I will be, in a few years, but until then— "Sarah, that's not possible," Ms. Rodriguez said kindly. "Then let her stay at least until you find a placement. Please, she's my sister." Mrs. Rodriguez exchanged a look with her colleague. We'll see what we can arrange. But this situation is complex. Everything's always complex, I said tiredly. But Lily didn't do anything wrong. None of this is her fault. I know, honey. Mrs. Rodriguez turned to Lily. Can you pack a bag? I need to take you to a temporary placement for tonight at least. Lily looked at me, terrified. I squeezed her hand again. It's going to be okay, I told her. I promise. It was a promise I intended to keep. The next 72 hours were chaos. My parents were formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, medical identity theft, and child endangerment. The story hit the news. Prominent local business owners arrested for adoption fraud made for compelling headlines. My father's car dealerships were investigated for financial irregularities. My mother was removed from the hospital board. Their perfect life came apart exactly as quickly as mine had in the first timeline. But this time, I was ready. I'd already contacted a lawyer. Well, I'd contacted several lawyers, actually. Using the money I'd carefully saved from birthdays and odd jobs, money I'd hidden in the same heirs, Vent as my journal. I explained everything, the falsified records, the medical identity theft, the way I'd been systematically erased and replaced. The lawyer, Ms. Park, had listened with increasing horror. Sarah, what your parents did isn't just immoral, it's criminal. And the fact that you documented everything. She'd looked at me with something like awe. How old are you? 14. You have the mind of a prosecutor. If only she knew. Ms. Park took the case pro bono. The publicity alone was worth it, she said. But I think she also genuinely wanted to help. She filed for emergency emancipation on my behalf. She helped me petition for custody of Lily, arguing that we'd bonded as sisters and separation would be traumatic. More importantly, she helped me access the full scope of my parents' crimes. Because it turned out the medical fraud was just the beginning. Once investigators started looking closely at my parents' financial records, they found years of insurance fraud. They'd been billing my insurance for treatments Lily received, claiming they were for me. They'd been writing off Lily's education and medical expenses as mine on their taxes. They'd even taken out a life insurance policy on me with significantly higher premiums because of my high-risk medical conditions. Conditions that were actually Lily's. If I died when I died in my first life, they would have collected hundreds of thousands of dollars while having spent most of their money on Lily's care that they'd disguised as mine. I'd been worth more to them dead than alive. They'd just been waiting for my conveniently terrible medical history to finish me off. Did you know, Ms. Park asked me one day as we reviewed the financial records, before you started documenting everything, did you know how deep this went? I thought about that county hospital, about dying alone with $47 to my name. About the years of medical bills I'd struggled to pay while my parents lived comfortably, having profited off my suffering. I suspected, I said. It was the truth in its way. The trial took 8 months. 8 months during which I lived in a supervised foster placement with Lily, both of us healing physically and emotionally. 8 months during which my parents' lawyers tried every defense they could think of. They were trying to help Lily. They'd made honest mistakes. The adoption agency had confused the records. Sarah was a troubled teen who'd fabricated evidence. None of it worked. The prosecution had my journal, the testimony of multiple doctors about the inconsistencies, the financial records showing years of fraud, and, most damningly, the testimony of Lily's previous foster parents, who confirmed that yes, she'd had medical issues, yes, they'd tried to get her treatment, yes, those issues had been documented. My parents had simply erased that documentation and replaced it with mine. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. My mother got 3 years, my father got 5. He'd been more involved in the financial fraud, apparently. Both were ordered to pay restitution, though by the time the legal fees and fines were paid, there wasn't much left. The dealerships were sold, the house was sold, the perfect life they'd built was dismantled piece by piece. I watched it all with a strange sense of detachment. In my first life, I died wishing I could make them understand what they'd done to me. In this life, I didn't need them to understand. I just needed them to face consequences, and they did. The day the sentencing was announced, Lily and I were in our foster placement, a small apartment with a kind woman named Teresa who'd been a nurse before retiring. We'd been there for 6 months by then, and it was the most stable either of us had been in years. Lily had started treatment for her actual medical conditions. Juvenile arthritis, yes, but also bipolar disorder that had gone undiagnosed for years, explaining so many of the behavioral issues in her foster care records. With proper medication and therapy, she was becoming a different person, happier, more confident, herself. I was healing too in ways that had nothing to do with my physical health. The weight of resentment I'd carried through my first life was gone. I'd gotten justice. Not revenge, justice. There was a difference. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Lily asked me that night, after we'd heard about the sentencing. "Yeah," I said. "I do." "I never thanked you," she said quietly, "for figuring it out, for making sure someone looked at the records. She paused. "You saved me. You know that, right?" I thought about the girl I'd been in my first life, bitter and resentful, who'd hated Lily without understanding she was a victim too. I thought about dying alone, carrying that hatred to my grave. "We saved each other," I said. It was true. By saving Lily, I'd saved myself. By refusing to be erased this time, I'd given both of us a chance to exist. The emancipation was granted when I turned 16, 2 years after the trial began. By then, I'd graduated high school early, gotten accepted to college with a full scholarship, and secured a job as a medical records specialist at a law firm. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I petitioned for guardianship of Lily, who was 17 by then and almost aged out of the system anyway. The judge approved it. We got our own apartment. Small, but ours. We made it a home. Lily graduated high school the next year. She got into art school on a scholarship. Her paintings were dark and beautiful, full of pain transformed into something meaningful. She was good. Really good. "What should I do with this one?" she asked one day, showing me a piece she'd been working on for months. It showed two girls, their shadows intertwining, their faces both separate and merged. "Sisters," I said. "Yeah," she smiled. "What do you think? Should I put it in my mom's portfolio?" "Absolutely." She did. It was the piece that got her a full ride to her dream school. As for me, I finished college in 3 years, then law school. I specialized in medical fraud and adoption law. I helped other kids who'd been used, erased, or exploited by the systems meant to protect them. I was good at it. Really good. On the 10th anniversary of my rebirth, which would have been the 10th anniversary of my death in the original timeline, I visited my parents. They were both out of prison by then, living in a small apartment across town, working menial jobs. The prominent business owners had become cautionary tales. My mother answered the door. She looked older, worn down, nothing like the polished woman who'd dug her nails into my shoulder in that doctor's office. "Sarah," she said. She didn't sound surprised. "Mom?" We looked at each other for a long moment. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I wanted to see if you understand yet. What you did, what it cost." She was quiet, then, "We were trying to help Lily." "No," I said. "You were trying to help yourselves. Lily was just convenient. So was I until I wasn't." "That's not—" She stopped. "We loved you. You loved the idea of me. The healthy, easy daughter you thought you were supposed to have. When I got sick, when I became complicated, you found a replacement. You literally gave her my identity and erased me. We didn't—" "You did. You took my medical history and gave it to her. You took her medical problems and gave them to me. You made me invisible in my own life. And when that wasn't enough, you waited for me to die so you could cash in on the insurance policy." My mother's face crumpled. "We never wanted you to die." "Didn't you? Because in the timeline where you succeeded, I did die at 28, alone, in a county hospital, with $47 in my bank account and a body destroyed by conditions that were never mine to begin with." She stared at me. "What are you talking about? What timeline?" I smiled. "It doesn't matter. In this timeline, I lived, and I made sure everyone knew what you did. You destroyed our lives." "No, I documented your crimes. There's a difference." I turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, Lily's doing well. She's happy, healthy, successful, everything you pretended you wanted for her. And you? I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I left without looking back. That night, Lily and I had dinner in our apartment. Bigger now, nicer, filled with her art and my books. We cooked together, laughing over inside jokes, comfortable in the life we'd built. Your parents called me today, she said as we ate. I looked up surprised. They did? Yeah, they wanted to know if I'd talk to you, try to get you to forgive them. What did you say? I said forgiveness isn't something they get to ask for through intermediaries. If they want to apologize, they can do it themselves. But also, she paused. I told them I didn't think they'd earned it, from either of us. I smiled. Good answer. I learned from the best. We finished dinner, cleaned up together, and settled on the couch to watch a movie. Halfway through, Lily fell asleep on my shoulder, just like she used to when we first moved in together, when nightmares still woke her up and she needed the reassurance that someone was there. I looked at her, my sister, my family, the person I'd saved by saving myself, and thought about the girl I'd been in my first life. Bitter, alone, dying with nothing but resentment and regret. That girl was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd taken the gift of a second chance and used it not just for revenge, but for justice, for healing, for building something better. The adoption agency had found the inconsistencies just like I'd planned. But what they'd really found was the truth, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you are the ones who hurt you most. That documentation matters. That evidence speaks louder than excuses, that some of us get a second chance and we'd better make it count. I pulled a blanket over Lily and let her sleep. Outside, the city hummed with life, with possibilities, with futures we got to choose this time. In my first life, I died on a Tuesday with nothing. In this life, I lived every day with everything that mattered. And that, I thought as I drifted off to sleep myself, was the best revenge of all, not making them suffer, though they had, but proving that I could thrive without them, that Lily could heal, that we could both exist fully and completely in a world that had tried to erase us. The adoption agency had found the inconsistencies, but I had found something better. I'd found myself. And I'd helped Lily find herself, too. Two girls who'd been used as pawns in someone else's game had become the players instead. We'd rewritten our stories on our own terms, and we'd made damn sure everyone knew our names.